January 9, 2024. A date burned into Ecuador's memory. What began as a normal Tuesday morning would spiral into an afternoon of terror, and a night the world will never forget. On the surface, the country looked calm. People commuting to work, children heading to school, markets opening their stalls. But beneath this fragile calm, something sinister was moving. Because somewhere, behind prison walls, a chain reaction had already begun, one that would soon detonate across the entire nation. It all started with a name, Adolfo Macias Villamar, better known as Fido. Leader of Los Choneros, Ecuador's most feared gang. His sudden disappearance from prison was more than an escape, it was a declaration. To his enemies, to the government, to millions of citizens, a message: you are no longer in control. Hours later, chaos erupted. Riots broke out in prisons across the country. Inmates armed with rifles and explosives stormed cell blocks, took guards hostage, and set entire compounds on fire. But the violence did not stay behind the walls. It spilled into the streets. In Guayaquil, gunmen hijacked buses. Explosions tore through neighborhoods. And then, something happened that paralyzed the nation. Live on national television, millions of Ecuadorians watched as masked men stormed the set of TC Television. News anchors were forced to the floor at gunpoint, while the cameras kept rolling. Viewers at home clutched their phones, frozen, unsure if what they were watching was real or fiction. The anchors' voices cracked as they were forced to read threats to the entire nation. For the first time, Ecuador saw its own collapse play out, live. President Daniel Noboa was rushed to an emergency bunker. His advisors warned, Ecuador was no longer facing isolated gang violence. This was something new, something darker. 22 gangs had moved as one. They weren't just criminals anymore. They were an insurgent force. And Noboa's response would shake the world. He declared a state of internal armed conflict, and officially labeled 22 gangs as terrorist organizations. In that moment, Ecuador became a war zone. Soldiers patrolled markets. Tanks rolled into neighborhoods. Helicopters circled above cities. The ordinary rhythm of daily life shattered, replaced by checkpoints, curfews, and the smell of burning streets. And yet, despite the military's presence, violence only spread further. Kidnappings. Targeted killings. Explosions rocking financial districts. Outside whispers grew louder, whispers of Mexico's Sinaloa cartel, Jalisco New Generation, and Colombian traffickers, all fueling Ecuador's sudden descent into war. By nightfall, Ecuador was unrecognizable. A peaceful nation turned battlefield in a matter of hours. Citizens huddled indoors, scrolling their phones, desperate to know what was happening outside. And in the silence between gunshots, one question echoed. Could the government survive a war against 22 gangs? Or had the gangs already won? The world remembers certain days as turning points. For Ecuador, that day came on January 9, 2024. A day when an entire nation found itself at war with 22 criminal gangs. This is the story of the chaos. The bloodshed. The hostages. The riots. And the desperate fight for survival. This is the day Ecuador declared war on 22 gangs.
You are watching True Crime Cartel Originals. Before we dive into today's story, I've got one small favor to ask. If you love deep, real stories like this, tap the like button, hit subscribe, and drop a comment below telling us which city you're watching from. It helps more than you know, and it allows us to keep bringing you stories no one else dares to tell. Now, let's get into the story.
Before the world saw flames, gunfire, and hostages on live television, Ecuador was a nation many associated with peace. A country defined by its breathtaking landscapes, the Andes Mountains, the Amazon rainforest, and the Galapagos Islands. Tourists came for beauty, not for blood. But geography is destiny. And Ecuador's geography would place it at the heart of one of the deadliest trades on earth, cocaine. To the north lies Colombia, the world's largest producer of coca. To the east, Peru, another major producer. and to the west, Ecuador's sprawling Pacific coastline, stretching for hundreds of miles, with ports that lead directly to the United States and Europe. For decades, traffickers saw Ecuador not as the battleground, but as the gateway. The country had strong ports, weaker security than Colombia, and less international scrutiny. Containers filled with bananas, shrimp, and cacao became the perfect cover for tons of hidden cocaine. The money was staggering. Billions of dollars in cocaine flowing through Ecuador every year. And where there is money, there is violence. But unlike Colombia's cartels of the 1980s, Ecuador's underworld wasn't dominated by one kingpin. It was fractured. Dozens of gangs competed for slices of the pie. And soon, alliances with Mexico's most notorious cartels would supercharge them into private armies. At the center of it all was Los Choneros. Originally born on the country's coast, Los Choneros became the most powerful gang in Ecuador. Led by figures like Jorge Luis Zambrano, alias Rasquina, and later Adolfo Fido Macias, they controlled prisons, ports, and drug routes. But their dominance was constantly challenged. Rising fast was Los Lobos, a brutal rival faction that split from Los Choneros. Los Lobos allied themselves with Mexico's Jalisco New Generation Cartel, importing not just weapons but tactics, creating paramilitary-style units. Alongside them, Los Tiguerones and Los Lagartos fought for power in coastal cities, terrorizing communities and turning neighborhoods into war zones. To outsiders, these might have looked like street gangs. Young men with tattoos and weapons. But inside Ecuador, everyone knew the truth. These weren't gangs. These were armies. Armies with assault rifles, grenades, armored vehicles, and communication networks that stretched from prison cells to international cartels. The prisons became their strongholds. Instead of being locked away, gang leaders ran their empires from behind bars. Guards were bribed or killed. Weapons smuggled inside. Entire prison blocks were controlled by different gangs, with each leader ruling like a warlord. The walls weren't holding them back, they were protecting them. Meanwhile, corruption hollowed out the state. Police officers moonlighted as cartel lookouts. Politicians accepted bribes to look the other way. Judges were assassinated for daring to resist. Slowly, the line between state and cartel blurred until, for many Ecuadorians, it no longer existed. By 2023, the tension was unbearable. Murder rates skyrocketed. Explosions rocked cities once considered safe. And whispers filled the air that Ecuador was on the verge of collapse. But no one, no politician, no police commander, no ordinary citizen, was prepared for what would happen next. Because the storm was coming. And when it hit, it would tear Ecuador apart. The spark came not from the streets, but from behind prison walls, and when it struck, it unleashed a wave of violence unlike anything Ecuador had ever seen. The disappearance of Fido was like a crack of thunder. But the lightning came next, inside the prisons of Ecuador. In a country where the state was supposed to be in control, it was the gangs who held the keys. And the moment the government pushed back, the prisons exploded. It began in Guayaquil's Penitenciaria del Litoral, one of South America's most notorious prisons. Guards on the morning shift walked into a nightmare, inmates armed with machetes, homemade explosives, even rifles smuggled in through corrupt officials. Within minutes, the guards were outnumbered. By the hour's end, they were hostages. The air was thick with smoke and screams. Prison blocks turned into war zones. Inmates lit mattresses on fire, choking the hallways with black clouds. The clatter of gunfire echoed against concrete, each shot bouncing like a warning through the labyrinth of cells. Prisoners executed guards with chilling precision, dragging bodies into courtyards as a message to the state. Cameras captured bloodstained walls, graffiti scrawled in gang symbols, and the sound of inmates chanting victory cries as if celebrating a festival of death. The government responded with force. Soldiers stormed facility after facility, armored vehicles parked outside razor wire fences, helicopters hovering above. But every raid was met with brutal resistance. These were not unorganized riots. This was coordinated warfare. By nightfall, the violence had spread. In Cotopaxi, Turi, and Latacunga, prisons erupted in synchronized uprisings. Inmates used cell phones to coordinate assaults, their commands bouncing through WhatsApp and Telegram groups faster than authorities could react. Prison by prison, the state was losing control. Inside, time slowed. Imagine the moment, a guard running down a smoke-filled corridor, coughing, searching for an exit, only to turn a corner and see a wall of inmates charging with blades. The sound of boots pounding concrete. The glint of steel in the flickering light. And then, silence. The brutality was staggering. Prisoners filmed their rampages on cell phones, posting executions online as propaganda. Entire wings were reduced to ash. Inmates carved gang insignias into walls, marking their territory as if the prisons themselves had become sovereign kingdoms. And yet, this was only part of the plan. As prisons burned, the gangs knew the government's eyes were fixed on razor wire and barred gates. But outside those walls, another nightmare was brewing. The chaos wasn't just about control of the prisons. It was a distraction. Because while soldiers fought to reclaim cell blocks, masked gunmen were preparing to unleash terror on the streets, and in front of millions of viewers. And then, the unthinkable happened. On the afternoon of January 9th, millions of Ecuadorians tuned into their daily television broadcast. The newsroom at TC Television was calm, ordinary, anchors sitting under bright studio lights, scripts in hand. Until the doors burst open. Gunmen stormed the set. Cameras kept rolling. Viewers at home gasped as anchors were thrown to the ground, rifles pressed against their heads. Ecuador was watching its democracy collapse, live on air. The prisons were burning, the streets were on fire, but now, every living room in Ecuador became a front-row seat to terror. This wasn't just gang warfare anymore. It was psychological warfare. And the entire world was about to witness it. It was January 9th, 2024. The prisons were already ablaze. The streets echoed with gunfire. But no one was prepared for what happened next. In the heart of Guayaquil, inside the studios of TC Television, producers prepared for the evening news. Cameras were adjusted, lights warmed the set, and anchors flipped through their scripts. It was routine. Familiar. The kind of calm you cling to when the world outside is collapsing. Then, the doors slammed open. At first, many thought it was a prank. A stunt. Some kind of bizarre skit. But the rifles were real. The shouts were real. And the anchors' faces, drained of color, eyes wide with fear, were unmistakably real. Millions of Ecuadorians sat frozen before their televisions. They had tuned in for headlines. Instead, they were witnessing history collapse, live on air. The studio floor turned into a battlefield. Anchors were dragged from their chairs. Producers were forced to the ground. Cameramen were kicked aside, yet the cameras never stopped rolling. The gunmen barked orders. One of them waved a pistol directly into the lens, as if addressing the entire nation. His mask hid his face, but his words cut like steel. Now you will see who controls Ecuador. In living rooms across Ecuador, families clutched each other. Children were pulled away from screens. Phones lit up with messages, "Turn on TC Television, now." This was no longer rumor. No longer whispers from prisons. This was terror, raw and undeniable, beamed into every home. Inside the studio, fear had a sound, shallow breaths, whimpers, and the heavy boots of men pacing with rifles. Some hostages were forced to kneel. Others had guns pressed to their heads. A single wrong movement could trigger bloodshed live, before an audience of millions. And all the while, the cameras kept rolling. Was this a coup? A message? A declaration of war? No one knew. The only certainty was dread. The anchors who once delivered the news had now become the news, symbols of a country unraveling in real time. And then, the demands began. The gunmen shouted about Fido, about prisons, about the government's crackdown. But their words were less important than their presence. Because in that moment, it wasn't the president or the army or the police who controlled the narrative. It was them. The gangs. For 15, 20, 30 minutes, the hostage crisis dragged on. Viewers watched in paralyzed horror, wondering, would these gunmen execute someone on live television? Would blood spill across their screens? Would the studio become a slaughterhouse in real time? The longer the cameras rolled, the heavier the silence became. And then, gunfire. Muffled. Off camera. The signal cut. The broadcast went black. Across Ecuador, millions of viewers were left staring at darkened screens, their hearts racing, ears ringing, minds racing to process what they had just witnessed. But the truth was undeniable. Ecuador had just watched itself cross a point of no return. The prisons had burned. The airwaves had been hijacked. And now, the war was spilling into the streets. Grenades. Car bombs. Executions. Ecuador was about to learn what happens when the state loses control of the narrative, in the battlefield. The black screen from TC Television was not an ending. It was a signal. Because the moment those cameras went dark, Ecuador's cities lit up in fire. Guayaquil, the country's largest port, the jewel of its Pacific coast, was the first to feel the shockwave. Gunmen poured into the streets in pickup trucks, their weapons raised, their faces masked. Within minutes, explosions rattled neighborhoods. Banks. Pharmacies. Schools. Nothing was off limits. In one neighborhood, a grenade was hurled at a police patrol car. The blast echoed like thunder, shattering windows, throwing debris across the road. The officers staggered out, injured, disoriented, only to be cut down by automatic gunfire. This was not random crime. This was military-style assault. Shops were looted. Civilians ducked behind counters, praying to remain unseen. A shop owner later recalled whispering to his wife as bullets punched holes through their storefront. "Don't move. Don't breathe. If they see us, we're dead." Elsewhere, a young mother clutched her child and ran. Her sandals slapped against the pavement, her child's cries piercing the night. Behind them, masked men opened fire on a bus, dragging passengers into the street. Some were used as human shields. Others were left behind. For the police, it was a nightmare. Their radios screamed with overlapping calls: car bombs downtown, kidnappings in the north, officers under attack in the south. Guayaquil had become a battlefield, and the police were outnumbered, outgunned, and paralyzed. And it wasn't just Guayaquil. In Esmeraldas, Quito, and Macala, coordinated strikes erupted. Gas stations exploded. Ambulances were hijacked. Even funeral homes were attacked, as if death itself was being mocked. One eyewitness in Quito described ducking behind her car as masked men shot indiscriminately into a crowd. "I could feel the bullets hit the ground next to my hands. I thought, this is it. This is the moment I die." The military was deployed, but even soldiers became targets. Convoys were ambushed with explosives hidden in trash cans and motorcycles. Video footage later surfaced of soldiers pinned down, their rifles blazing into smoke-filled streets as civilians screamed around them. Ecuador was watching its cities dissolve into war zones. And as the chaos spread, so did the fear. Schools shut down. Hospitals overflowed with gunshot victims. Families barricaded their doors, whispering prayers as distant gunfire echoed through the night. But the gangs were everywhere. They controlled the streets. They owned the night. For those trapped in the crossfire, time slowed. Every second was a lifetime. The line between civilian and combatant blurred, and no place felt safe. The war had left the prisons and the television studio. Now it was in every street, every home, every corner of Ecuador. And yet, this was not the peak. Because the gangs were about to escalate to an even darker level. Guayaquil burned. Quito trembled. And across Ecuador, families hid in silence. But as the streets filled with blood and fire, the gangs had only just begun their message. Next came the car bombs, the executions, and the targeted assassinations that would shake Ecuador's democracy to its very core. Cities that were once bustling with life now moved to the rhythm of fear. After the prison uprisings and the shocking hostage crisis on live TV, Ecuador had entered a phase of violence it had never experienced before. But the gangs, they weren't finished. They wanted to send a message, one written in fire, blood, and terror. The assassinations began almost immediately. Politicians, prosecutors, police commanders, men who had once believed they were untouchable, now found themselves hunted in broad daylight. In Guayaquil, a city official was gunned down at point-blank range, his car riddled with bullets before he could even open the door. In Quito, a prosecutor investigating Los Lobos was ambushed outside his office, his bodyguard killed instantly, his blood staining the courthouse steps. These were not random killings. These were executions. Cold, calculated, and theatrical. Each one was staged to humiliate the state, to show Ecuadorians that the gangs, not the government, were in control. And then came the car bombs. The first explosion tore through a quiet neighborhood in Guayaquil, shattering windows, flipping cars, and sending fire into the night sky. Residents described the blast as an earthquake, a roar so loud it felt like the sky itself had ripped open. Another car, parked outside a police barracks, erupted into flames just hours later. Panic spread. If nowhere was safe, then everywhere was dangerous. For ordinary Ecuadorians, daily life had become a lottery of survival. Shopkeepers closed early, praying their stores wouldn't be targeted. Parents rushed their children home from school, scanning every alley, every parked car, every shadow. Taxi drivers refused to work after dark. The gangs wanted fear to take root, and it did. Every assassination, every car bomb, every sudden burst of gunfire reinforced a single truth: Ecuador was now a battlefield. But as the bodies piled up and the smoke filled the skies, another question began to haunt the streets: if this was only the beginning, how much worse could it get? By now, the assassinations and car bombs had shaken Ecuador to its core. The nation was bleeding, and the government could no longer pretend this was just a crime wave. It was war. And so, the president made a decision that would change everything. Ecuador was placed under a national state of emergency. The announcement came on live television. The president's voice was stern, his eyes heavy. Behind him, the national flag swayed in silence. He declared a curfew, ordered the military onto the streets, and promised that Ecuador would no longer bow to the cartels. But outside the palace walls, the country was already burning. Within hours, armored vehicles rolled into Guayaquil, Quito, and Cuenca. Soldiers marched through intersections usually filled with children and market vendors. The sound of helicopters thundered overhead, their spotlights sweeping over rooftops in search of gunmen. Checkpoints sprang up across the highways. Cars were stopped, searched, and sometimes confiscated. Men were pulled from vehicles, their faces pressed against asphalt as soldiers demanded answers. Ecuador had become a militarized zone. Inside the prisons, special forces stormed cell blocks still smoldering from the uprisings. Tear gas filled the air as masked units forced inmates to the ground, their boots echoing across blood-stained corridors. The gangs had made prisons their castles. Now, the government was trying to storm the gates. But the gangs were not afraid. From behind bars, they sent videos, prisoners shouting, waving homemade weapons, swearing that for every gang member captured or killed, more blood would flow in the streets. Ecuador was trapped in a cycle of threats and retaliation. In Guayaquil, the army patrolled neighborhoods known as cartel strongholds. Entire families watched from behind barred windows, too afraid to step outside. Children whispered questions their parents couldn't answer: will the soldiers protect us, or will the gangs kill us anyway? The state of emergency was supposed to bring order. But in reality, it brought uncertainty. Soldiers in the streets created the illusion of control, but assassinations and explosions still echoed in the night. For every gang leader captured, another attack erupted. International cameras turned to Ecuador. Newscasters spoke of a country collapsing into narco-chaos. To the world, it looked as if the state was finally fighting back. But inside Ecuador, people were asking the question nobody wanted to hear: was the government truly in control, or had the cartels already won? And yet, as tanks rumbled and soldiers patrolled, something even more dangerous was brewing. The gangs had not been silenced. They had only been provoked. And their next response would send shockwaves far beyond Ecuador's borders. The world was watching. For decades, the drug war had been synonymous with Colombia, Mexico, and Central America. But now, Ecuador, once considered an island of peace, had erupted into scenes of chaos that stunned even the most hardened observers. The message was clear: if this could happen in Ecuador, it could happen anywhere. Foreign news outlets ran the footage on repeat. The storming of TC Television, the prison massacres, the car bombs, these images replayed across television screens from New York to Madrid to Tokyo. The world sat frozen, asking the same question: how did it come to this? In Washington, U.S. officials convened urgent meetings. Ecuador was not just another country in crisis, it was a key transit hub for cocaine bound for American and European cities. If Ecuador fell, the flow of drugs would surge unchecked. For the DEA, the Pentagon, and intelligence agencies, this was no longer Ecuador's problem. It was theirs too. Meanwhile, in Colombia, whispers spread that cartels were watching closely. If Ecuador's gangs could paralyze an entire country, what would stop others from doing the same? Narco-violence was no longer contained by borders, it was contagious. Europe, too, paid attention. Rotterdam and Antwerp, ports already overwhelmed by cocaine seizures, traced much of their cargo back to Ecuador's Guayaquil. Now, with gangs openly waging war on the state, European authorities feared a flood unlike anything before. In the streets of Ecuador's cities, foreign nationals were evacuated. Embassies warned their citizens to stay indoors, cancel travel, and avoid public gatherings. The perception was clear: Ecuador had become a war zone. Journalists on the ground described a nation in freefall. They spoke of bodies on sidewalks, military patrols every few blocks, and civilians whispering about which gang controlled which neighborhood. For the first time, the international press framed Ecuador not as a nation with a gang problem, but as a state fighting for survival. In South America, neighboring leaders issued statements of solidarity, but also fear. Peru tightened its border security. Colombia increased patrols along the frontier. Brazil warned of spillover violence. The collapse of Ecuador threatened to destabilize the entire region. And yet, while politicians debated, cartels moved in silence. Intelligence reports revealed that Mexican groups, including the feared Sinaloa and Jalisco New Generation Cartel, had already expanded their influence inside Ecuador. This was no longer just Ecuador's war. It was an international drug empire staking its claim. By the time the world realized the scale of the threat, the cartels were already 3 steps ahead. Ecuador's chaos was not an isolated eruption, it was a warning. And as the world braced itself, Ecuador's people were left with a haunting question: if the state couldn't save them, who would? When the smoke finally began to clear, Ecuador was a country transformed. Streets once filled with music and markets now carried the silence of fear. The official death toll was staggering, dozens in the first days alone, but the true number, whispered in neighborhoods and morgues, was far higher. Families gathered outside prisons, desperate for news of loved ones. Some prayed their relatives had survived the massacres. Others prayed they were not among the missing. The prisons themselves were charred shells, walls blackened, the smell of smoke and blood still hanging heavy in the air. The government declared victory, but many doubted it. Yes, soldiers patrolled the streets. Yes, checkpoints were set up. But the gangs still existed, powerful, organized, and patient. They had lost men, but they had not lost their grip. Ordinary Ecuadorians paid the heaviest price. A shopkeeper whispered, "We live between 2 fires, the gangs and the government. Neither protects us. We are on our own." This was the new reality. To survive, people avoided certain streets, kept their heads down, and spoke only in whispers. In the weeks that followed, investigators pieced together fragments of the chaos. But so many questions remained unanswered. How had Adolfo Macias Villamar, Fido, vanished from his prison cell so easily? Who had helped him? And where was he now? Some claimed he had fled the country, hidden by allies abroad. Others swore he was still in Ecuador, orchestrating everything from the shadows. To this day, his fate remains one of the most disturbing mysteries in Ecuador's drug war. Then there were the gangs themselves. Los Lobos, Los Tiguerones, Los Lagartos, groups once considered local street outfits, had shown the capacity of private armies. Their alliances shifted like smoke, leaving analysts wondering who really commanded Ecuador's underworld. The state, battered but unbroken, vowed to continue its crackdown. But corruption still ran deep. Judges released gang members on technicalities. Police units were rumored to be on cartel payrolls. Even politicians were whispered to have ties to narco-money. Could Ecuador truly fight back when the enemy was not just on the streets, but inside the institutions of power? For the international community, the crisis served as a warning shot. If Ecuador could descend into chaos in days, what about other nations sitting on the same trafficking routes? The future of the drug war was no longer about Colombia or Mexico alone, it was spreading, mutating, and escalating. And so Ecuador entered a fragile calm, a silence not of peace, but of exhaustion. Everyone knew the war was far from over. The gangs had not been destroyed. They had only been wounded. And in the world of cartels, a wound is never the end. It is the beginning of something darker. In the end, Ecuador's war was not won or lost. It simply paused, like a beast catching its breath in the dark. The people waited. The gangs regrouped. And the government braced for the next strike. But history teaches us something about wars with cartels: they do not end neatly. They do not sign peace treaties. They spread, like a fire that finds new wood to burn. Some say Ecuador's tragedy was inevitable. A nation wedged between cocaine superpowers, drowning in corruption, left exposed as cartels sought new routes to Europe, Asia, and beyond. Others believe it was preventable. That stronger leadership, cleaner institutions, and international support might have stopped the bloodshed before it began. But the truth is harsher. Once the first prison gates fell, once the first news anchor was held at gunpoint, once the first car exploded, Ecuador could never go back to the way it was. Children now walk past chalk outlines on their way to school. Families eat dinner with televisions turned low, waiting for the next announcement, the next emergency decree. The silence after the chaos is sometimes worse than the chaos itself. Because silence is fragile. It can be shattered in an instant. And perhaps the most chilling question of all is not what happened in Ecuador, but what happens next. When a nation opens the gates of war against 22 gangs, there is no closing them. Not truly. Not ever. So we end not with answers, but with echoes. Echoes of gunfire. Echoes of sirens. Echoes of a country caught between two worlds, the land it was, and the battlefield it has become. This was Ecuador's warning to the world. The day the cartels declared war, and the nation declared it back. The story is not over. It has only just begun. If this story gripped you, if it shook you as much as it shook me while telling it, don't let it end here. Hit that like button, it tells me you want more deep dives into the stories the world forgets. Subscribe and turn on the bell so you never miss the next investigation, because the cartels aren't going away, and neither are the stories. And I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below, tell me where you're watching from, and what moment hit you the hardest. And finally, share this video. Let more people see what really happened, because stories like these shouldn't be buried. This channel is small, but together, we can make these stories impossible to ignore.